books that when you read them, you become absolutely engrossed in their world and you immediately want to reread. And here are a few books that gave me that feeling. For whatever reason, I will try to explain to the best of my abilities. But here is the list, and yeah, hopefully I give you something to pick up or something to reread, because some of these books, I feel like actually all these books have something very special in them. And I don't know if they'd speak to just me alone or speak to people in general, but I just felt something when I was reading them. So the first book I have is The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. This is still one of my favorite books I've ever read since the moment I read it, and maybe it's time to return. Maybe it's time to go through this with you guys, because there's a whole lot of stuff in here. And in fact, I could actually go through these chapters. Maybe that's a good idea for a future video or a future video series. But the basic premise of this book is that through the eyes of a prophet, Gibran spreads his wisdom to the world. And Gibran's interesting because he doesn't consider himself a philosopher. He doesn't consider himself in any way bounded by those sets of ideas, because people tried to coin him with that idea, and he said, no, that's not me. And really what he's saying there is that I speak to the soul, I speak to the spirit, I don't speak to the world. And think about what a philosopher is. A philosopher tries to create a system for the world that everyone can live effectively by, but Gibran lives effectively through the heart, and that's really what you get from this book. And the story follows a prophet who's leaving his city. The first time I read it, I thought he was dying. Maybe it's not that deep, maybe it's not that intense, or maybe it is. But essentially, the prophet's leaving, and he's giving advice to his city one last time. And the city asks him questions from how to raise a child, to how to view sadness, to how to experience life as a whole. And the quote that I always come back to from this book is that every sorrow deepens your joy. Every time you experience pain, it allows you to appreciate the good times. It allows you to experience the good times, because without that juxtaposition, there's no meaning, there's no depth. Think about your greatest triumphs. Was it something that was handed to you, or was it something that you worked for? Was it something that you struggled with? And it's always the thing we struggle with that means the most to us in the end, when we finally succeed, when we finally win. And I really think Gibran's one of the finest writers who ever lived, and I think there's a whole lot of stuff in it. And every time I read a Gibran work, especially this one, this is one of his better ones. I don't know if it's quite my favorite, but it's certainly up there in terms of the just sheer wisdom and genius that you can see in the poetry. And yeah, it's a tremendous work. It's really something I really, really want to revisit, and every time I pick it up, it just feels special. I don't have to read it. I can remember the experience I had while reading it. But on to the next thing. The next thing is Rilke's Book of Hours, Love Poems to God. This is a book that I've gone back to, and I've read a few poems, whether on stream, whether just to myself, and every time I read a singular one, and in fact I'll read one right now. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. I circle around God, around the primordial tower. I've been circling for thousands of years, and I still don't know. Am I a falcon, a storm, or a great song? And I think that perfectly encapsulates the entire work. And there's about 100 poems that are more or less like that in this book. And Rilke's just able to capture something about the ideas of God, and the ideas of not necessarily like the way we structure it in a normal sense, not necessarily like the dogmatic or the you must do this or you must do this, but more so the roomy side of God, the idea of love, the idea of acceptance, the idea of something that pervades everything and anything at the same time and ties us all together. And I really love the way Rilke puts it together. I'm so fascinated in the future to learn other languages, to read some of these authors in the original language, because I feel like there's certainly so much missing. I know this book doesn't preserve the rhyme scheme, and I don't necessarily like rhyming. I feel like it kind of binds the poetry, it kind of binds the writing to a set structure, which in some way can benefit. In others, I think it forces the author to not express themselves fully and express themselves in the way in which they want to. But that's a whole other issue. But what I really love about these poems is that Rilke is speaking to the soul. He's speaking to the heart. He's not speaking to any doctrine. He's he's trying to experience something through his writing, and this is something that when you come back to, you can certainly see and you can certainly feel every time you go back to rereading it. And each time I've returned to this book, I felt a whole new appreciation for Rilke. And yeah, there's some really 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 beautiful lines in this book, and I really urge you to pick it up. The next thing we have is The Old Man and the Sea by Ernest Hemingway. I think this is the only thing I've read by Hemingway. I think I have two more books that I have of him, but I have not read them yet. But this really did make me a fan of Hemingway, and this book is certainly something special. It's a book that is seemingly very mundane because it's about a fisherman who is essentially kind of past his prime. People don't think that he can catch a large fish anymore, and he's set out to prove them wrong. And through this mundane story, he captures somewhat a mythic scale of humanity and a fight against mortality itself, a fight against old age, and what happens when we are diminishing physically but we are still there mentally. How do we persist? How do we keep fighting? And it's really a story about triumph over old age, triumph over life itself, and how we are so much more capable than we really are. I don't necessarily want to spoil it because I think it's a really really good story, and I think it's really meant to be a testament to the human will, the human spirit, and the undyingness of our fight for life and our lust for life. And you know, through this story of the sea, Hemingway is able to capture just what it means to be a human being, what it means to fight, what it means to be able to rebel against the entire world all at once and the entire idea of death. And it's so short too. That's the other reason it's so fun, is because I read it and I picked it up and I finished it within a day, and I'm like, wow, this is something special, and it's certainly something I'm going to return to. And it's definitely one of those stories that I'm either going to read to my kids or I'm going to make my kids read themselves, and I'm going to enjoy it with them as well. I feel like that's going to be a very awesome experience when I'm able to do that in the future. All right, the next thing we have is the Divine Comedy, in particular the Inferno, because it's the only one I've read so far. This is quickly becoming one of my new favorite works. I don't know how to describe it. It truly is one of the best books ever written. It's up there with the likes of the Odyssey, the Iliad, the Aeneid, any of the other great epic poems. Far better than Ulysses in my mind. I enjoyed it pretty much like every other great author has. I'm not calling myself a great author, but I can see why my favorite authors have just devoured this work, such as Blake, who literally taught himself Italian so that he could read this book in his dying years, such as Borges, who we're going to talk about next, who completely engrossed himself in this, such as James Joyce, who essentially tried to deconstruct the entire idea of Dante through his writings. And there's just you can't really talk about literature or poetry without talking about Dante, and now I see why, because the Inferno is something that creates its own mythos, creates its own world, uses its own symbols, tries to separate the need for the church and the idea of spirit and the idea of creativity and the idea of higher ideals in itself from the structures that have been imposed upon man. And essentially this is why Dante was put into exile, because he was trying to tell people that the kingdom of heaven is within you. That's really what he's trying to say with this book. But the Inferno is something that you can tell there's a deeper layer to it. Like, I'm reading it and I'm seeing all of these things that really 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 get my Sherlock Holmes cap on. It's 34 chapters, and the other two works are 33 and 33. Whenever you see 33, something's up. There's definitely some gematria with the lines. You can tell the structure is very perfect. There's all sorts of things. There's references to these mythic people. There's references that you can go research. There's allegory and metaphors, and there's certainly something deeper to this book as I'm reading it. And I feel like I'm getting the story as I'm going through it on my first go through. But I feel like if I really wanted to understand Dante, I'd have to read it 100 times, 200 times, 1,000 times, because there's just so much inside of this. And not only that, I'm reading it in a different language. So when I go to the original, there's certainly something so much deeper. It's like how there when the Old Testament was translated from Hebrew to Latin, a lot of the gematria went missing, and then there was a lot of criticism like you're not reading the real text because you're missing all of the deeper meaning, you're missing all of the gematria and the secret messaging and all sorts of things that were meant to be preserved through this text. And I know we're getting into very weird territory, but I'm just saying that as I'm reading Dante, I understand that there's so much that I don't understand, and it's just a marvel to read, and it's definitely different than Ulysses, because Ulysses is difficult to read on purpose, whereas Dante's simple to read, but the deeper meaning is right in front of you. It's asking you to be seen, but you can't see it because you haven't looked at it hard enough, and it's like the perfect mystery. It's like the perfect case that I am going to probably spend a lot of time in the rest of my life delving into and going through. So yeah, hopefully this inspires you to pick up the Divine Comedy, because it's one of the best things I've ever read. Next thing we have is Jorge Luis Borges. I don't say it right. It's Borges or something like that. I heard a video say it, and I was so mad because Borges is one of my favorite writers, and like I know I'm like just butchering his name every time I say it. It's like the guy that wrote Faust. It's like Gautier. I don't know how to say it, and no one's corrected me. So it's more so your guys' fault, because I ask you guys to correct me every time. So if you know how to say it, please mention it in the comments. But yeah, this work is Ficciones, or Fictions, by Borges. I don't know what else to say aside from this work is some of the most special stuff I've ever read. And really what Borges tries to do is he tries to create scenarios that are even impossible to think about. I know that sounds like a cope, but like really what he's trying to do is he's trying to shift the way that you see the world. Shift the way that you see the world, and get rid of the order that you see it in, because the world is so much more than what we can see. Essentially the Platonic ideal forms. I say this every video, I say this in all of the things I'm talking about, but I need to reiterate it because it's such an important theme. And what I mean by this is that Borges is wishing to create a image or an idea that's even difficult to think about, to show how difficult the world is to understand. My favorite story in it is the first story. I think it's the finest thing that I've ever read by him, even amongst the likes of his poems and his works of nonfiction. But it's just so special. It's called Tilan Ukbar Orbis Tertius. And don't worry about the name because it's meant to be difficult. Essentially, it's about Borges, the character in the story, is trying to find out about this fictional society, and he's trying to track down all these documents, and he's trying to somewhat discover and rediscover this old idea of a society that was so good with their mind, so good with their imagination, that they could recreate life simply with thought. And it's a very interesting way to have a story. It's a very interesting story kind of structure. And this is what I mean, Borges is trying to force you to think about things that are impossible to think about. Because how do we rediscover lost knowledge that's completely lost? How do we rediscover the higher faculties of our mind and the almost mythic scale of humanity if we can't even, if we don't have an example to go off of? There's other stories such as the Library of Babel, which is a very interesting one, essentially about the entire experiences of humanity and the never-endingness of it, and how it's all forgotten at one point, but all rediscovered, and how it's kind of from this one central collective, a very Jungian idea, but it's fascinating because half of the story he's describing the architecture of the library, and really just going to show and forcing you to think about things that you haven't thought about in order to kind of break the spell of life. And really what Borges does is he creates this dreamlike feeling to all of his writing. And to me, the purpose of creating that dreamlike feeling is to remind you that the way that you are living is also a dream. That, what's the difference between these ideas and your reality? Because, the world is a set of paradoxes that we try to put into nice, tight boxes that really can order things, but we always miss meaning through that way. We always miss meaning through that lens. And what is the world, and how do we live in it, and how do we come to grips with these realities? And all these questions I don't think there's an answer to. And I think that's really the central theme of Borges' writing, is that we have to come to a head with these paradoxes. We have to face these paradoxes, and we have to, in some way, find a way to live in these paradoxes. And yeah, with that said, these are the books that the minute I finished, I wanted to reread because I wanted to recapture that feeling. I wanted to live in that world. I wanted that world to continue to live on in my head. And with that said, let me know some books that you instantly wanted to reread, because I think this is a very interesting topic, and I think this really reveals the strength of a work that, you didn't want it to end, that you wanted to immediately go back and find the finer details, go back and look for those Easter eggs, go back and look for those things that you might have missed on a first reading. So with that said, I love you guys so much. Thank you guys so much. Peace out. I'll catch you in the next one.